Now, you've likely heard of the possibility of a seller leaseback or a seller rentback. There is also the possibility of buyer's early possession of the property before closing. But is it right for you? Let's take a look. My name is Andrew Finney, and my passion is helping you make sense of real estate. If you need help finding a top agent near you, or if you simply want to drop me a line to say hello, my contact info is below. If you're new here, please go ahead and subscribe to this channel now and like this video. Thank you. All right, my friend, it's important to keep an open mind when we're talking about real estate negotiations. Just like a seller leaseback or a rentback could be favorable to you and be one of the terms you're looking for from a buyer on the flip side could have a possible request for early possession of the property before closing. So we should understand what this is and how it plays out for you to help you make the right decision and best decision for you. So the first thing to understand is, what are the possible pitfalls of buyer's early possession? Ultimately, you, the seller, will decide if it's something that you wish to do or not. A lot of listing agents will advise against this, and there are some reasons why. Let's take a look at four of the most common. The first one is possible mortgage underwriting issues. Let's say that you grant the buyer access to live in the property early, and then only to have in the closing process the buyer fall out of contract because they couldn't get final approval. Now, you might be wondering, well, why wouldn't they get final approval, Andrew? But what happens if while they're living there, they got super excited, they decided to take out credit to go buy some new furniture, or they decided to go buy a new vehicle, or anything along those lines that have to do with new credit and new loans? It could absolutely destroy what's called their debt to income ratio and knock them off the charts from a mortgage underwriting perspective. If that were to happen, now you basically have turned your home you wanted to sell into a rental until they're going to get out, which would have been best to have specified in a rights of surrender if something happens in the buyer's escrow phase. All the same, now you got to get them out just so you can sell your house again. How's that going to affect you? The second thing is, what happens if the buyer believes the house is already theirs because they're living in it? Now, we both know what it's like to move into your new house, and one of the first things that most of us want to do is what? Do some kind of renovation project, do some kind of painting, do something to the house to begin making it our own, right? Well, so are going to be the buyers that move into the property early. It would not be uncommon for them to want to do renovation projects because they're starting to see the house as their own. And as they explore the property and as they're moving in, they're thinking, you know what? Before we put this furniture in place, we really should do the kitchen remodel. Or before we do this, we really should do the master bathroom remodel. Or you know what? This room has carpet in it. I really want wood floors. You get the idea of where this is going. What happens if they start renovation projects and then they can't close on the property, and maybe those renovations took away value or weren't done when you needed to evict them to be able to go back on the market to sell your house? This is a very real concern and one to consider closely with your trusted real estate advisor. On the same token, that takes you to the third thing that could go wrong here, and that's what happens if the buyer begins making a laundry list of repairs they want seen. Almost like if they were a tenant of a property and they're like, oh, well, I'm just going to submit this list to a landlord because these are all the things that need to go on with this property. I noticed that light's burnt out. I noticed that fixture is not working. I noticed that there's a settling crack on that wall. Oh, by the way, the toilet leaks. And yeah, I get it. I didn't ask for any of these on my repair request to you, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, but now I'm asking for you because I've been in the property and I really want them fixed. Well, the issue could be is once you pass the repair request and everybody's agreed to it, why are you going to be asking for more repairs, and how do you as a seller know that they weren't the ones that caused the issue to begin with? Something to think about closely with your trusted real estate advisor. And the fourth big issue is, what happens if the buyer simply trashes out the property? Let's say that their mortgage fails, they gotta move out, they started a renovation project, they get really angry because their mortgages are gonna go through, they're not gonna be able to buy the home, they put some money into it for the renovation they wanted to do to it, and now they're like, you know what, the heck with this, I am trashing this place and I am out. What happens in that case now that you have a home to repair when all you really wanted to do to begin with was simply sell it to a well-qualified buyer so that you can get onto your next destination? All of these things I'm sharing with you aren't to scare you, they're to prepare you, because by every token that there's a bad thing, we also know there's a good thing. Now, every coin has two sides. It's like the yin and yang effect where you could have good and you can have bad. That's why it's on a case-by-case basis, and it's best to chat it out with your trusted real estate advisor. Speaking of that, now let's move on to the considerations for an early possession agreement. There are 9 basic things that you want to consider if you're seriously entertaining an early possession agreement. The first one is the verbiage of what happens if the sale is not consummated. In other words, what what happens if the buyer doesn't close on time? Or what happens if the property never closes? Then we have to answer 2 questions about how soon do they have to move out and what is the process if they refuse to vacate. The second thing to consider is, are you going to be charging them rent? If so, how much and when is it payable? And will you be requiring a security deposit? And the third thing is that have verbiage in the contract that reads that the buyer agrees in writing that they will not be making any changes to the property until after the closing date. After the time that the property is now legally theirs, they can begin the home renovation and the home improvements as they see fit, but not while they're there in early possession. We also need to have the safeguard in place that the buyer is further agreeing that if they do any alterations to the property, that they agree to pay to return the house back to its former state and condition when they have to vacate the property if they are unable to close on the house. The fourth consideration is, how are the utilities going to work? Do they need to be set up in the new buyer's name that is now your tenant essentially? Or are you going to continue paying for the utilities while they're there? Are you factoring that amount into the monthly rent? Or is that something they're paying separate and distinct? These are the minute details that come to play when considering this option. The fifth consideration to have is what happens with the trash. Now we know that if they're living there, they should be carrying out that trash. They should be making sure that it's disposed of correctly, right? This should be a no-brainer, but let's spell it out in writing to make sure that everybody understands the terms moving forward. Speaking of that, what happens with the landscaping? Are you going to continue paying for the landscaping or having it performed or performing it yourself while the buyers are in early possession of the property prior to closing? Or is that something that they'll begin paying or doing themselves? It's just one more point to consider. The sixth consideration is the realities of your homeowner's insurance. Since you still legally own the property, you'll need to get with your insurance agent and ask them their advice to make sure that you have appropriate coverage while the time that that buyer is in the property on early possession. And it would be extremely wise to have the buyer get rental insurance during that time period in question to ensure that their personal belongings and effects are insured while you, the homeowner, have appropriate insurance on the house until the day it closes. Have that conversation with your insurance agent and make sure that you understand what liabilities you may be assuming under this arrangement. The seventh is the understanding that the buyer who is in early possession of property cannot be renting out the property or the rooms to other people because they haven't even closed on it. It's not theirs yet. They don't reserve the right to try to make money off of the property until they close on your property. Let's make sure they're not subletting any rooms in the process. The eighth thing is that a lot of standard forms for early possession will release you, the seller, of a lot of liability if something happens to the property under the buyer's possession. Essentially, the buyer would now be waiving any rights for future repair requests or waiving any rights to say that you need to come out and do work to the property, or if something happens to the property under the buyer's care, then you should have a release of liability as well. Now, notice that I said early on for standard forms. What's the best way to determine what's in a contract or not? To have the conversation with your trusted real estate advisor. And in fact, if you feel more comfortable having a conversation with the real estate attorney, you reserve that right as a seller as well, just to ensure that you understand all of your options and the ins and outs of this arrangement. And the ninth thing to consider is what happens if the buyers have pets. Are you going to allow that? Most buyers aren't going to leave their pets because our pets are like our kids, right? So you need to understand whether there's going to be pets involved or not, and whether that's something that you're comfortable with moving forward. All of that said, sometimes this works out really, really good. Let me give you a case in point from my own personal life. In 2016, I went to purchase a new property, but I had a home that I needed to sell. I knew that home would sell quickly based upon all the renovations that I did on it, and by that time I'd earned my real estate license and helped about 90 families or so successfully close on buying and selling a house. So I knew what was going on with the property I had to sell, I knew how long it was going to take to sell, and I knew how to write an offer to the seller. All the same, I write the offer to the seller agrees to accept my contract contingent upon the sale of my other property. Here's the thing though, I needed that home to close to meet the conditions of the loan I was getting for the new home. So I needed to close as soon as possible, so on this other side of buying the new place that I could close sooner on that house. Big conundrum for me as a home seller slash home buyer in that case was what? Where do I go when the buyer wants to assume possession of that property because that buyer had a rental contract that was coming up and needed to be in that property by a certain date? Yet I, as a seller in that case, had nowhere to go, but I had this home I was buying and it was just sitting there vacant because the seller was not in the house. So I say, let me ask the listing agent and see if the seller would be comfortable with an early possession. Come to find out, after we listed out those 9 considerations that I just shared with you, we made everybody happy. I agreed that I wouldn't make any alterations to the property property, I agreed that I would pay for all the utilities, carry renter's insurance, and everybody was made whole. I paid rent in that case, which still baffles me to this day why I had to pay rent for a house I was buying, but nonetheless, it's one of those considerations, and a buyer that would be in my position just wants to close on their new home. But the reality was what? I had nowhere to go, and I had all my household effects already getting ready to get moved out, but I needed a place to put them. So there's a lot of different considerations and thoughts that go into this, which will take us to the third consideration, and that's to have empathy and compassion. If you're empathetic and compassionate with a buyer, you can put together really good negotiations with logic and savvy that both protect you and them in the case of early possession. At the end of the day, it's something that you have to look and explore inside your own mind's eye and your own heart to know if it's right for you to do or not. By understanding both the pitfalls and the virtues of such an arrangement, it'll help guide you to the right decision that's best for you. Okay, so now let's talk about how the closing process works when selling a house. And just in case you're curious now about a seller leaseback, let's talk about what is a seller rentback. Looking forward to our next conversation. See you in a few.